Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level. Hello, welcome to Fired Up, the startup marketing podcast. My name is Morgan McClintock, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Chris Ulbrich. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks, Morgan. Today, we're talking about how you market to an audience that rejects the very idea of marketing. That's a challenge for startups that sell to developers. There's no tougher assignment than selling to the no BS engineers who hang out on Reddit, Stack Overflow, and Hacker News. They're allergic to spin, skeptical of media. It's a triple black diamond challenge of tech marketing. In fact, if you do it right, you might say it's not marketing at all. Certainly not mass marketing. It's all about relationships.
Yes, today we're going to be talking about developer relations and technical copywriting, and we're joined by Erik Dietrich, who is the CEO of HitSubscribe, unique marketing business that helps companies reach software engineers with content. His background, however, is not originally in marketing. His career arc includes roles as a programmer, a software architect, a dev manager, a CIO, IT management, and a strategy consultant. So he comes from that background and now is in technical marketing. So Erik, welcome to Fired Up.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I want to start with something topical, and in the news at the moment is OpenAI, hot on the heels of their Dev Day, which they announced the creation of like a ChatGPT or GPT store, where developers can publish their own bots. Some have said it's like the dawn of the App Store on the iPhone. This is the next iteration of that. And then literally a week after, they had a week of tumult in which the CEO, Sam Altman, was fired and has just been reinstated. This is a time when they're trying to attract developers to commit time to build and publish on their platform and in their store. How do you think developers will respond to that?
Generally speaking, I think that developers tend to view the proof as being in the pudding. So if they were predisposed to going into the marketplace and building on top of it, I don't know that this sort of like amazing drama going on in the C-suite would necessarily impact them. That said, if initially they got into a new marketplace and found that there was a bad experience or wasn't living up to expectations, then they might flip over more quickly in their opinions on something, speaking broadly about the market. So you can definitely lure an audience of software developers to participate in something by creating a good developer experience. I think where the audience would start to get skeptical is when they're already encountering programs and then or problems, and then they might start to head for the hills, so to speak.
Right. And, there's been so much speculation about the source of all the tumult over at OpenAI and whether it had to do with, a conflict between the sort of the builders and the people who want to put guardrails around the process. And so that's why I thought it was so interesting that it was announced today that the presumptive chair of the new reconstituted board is going to be Bret Taylor, who has held all sorts of high-profile positions, co-CEO at Salesforce and, chairman of the board at Twitter, and it was CTO at Facebook. But, before all that, he actually founded the developer products group at Google. And it just, it struck me as a sort of an acknowledgement of the quiet clout that engineers have in the tech industry and developers. We're all, familiar with the famous video of, Steve Ballmer chanting developers, developers, developers. Every so often, there is this reminder that this is a huge and powerful audience that is not easy to reach through traditional, marketing methods. It's an audience that so many companies want to, and so many, and some have been very successful reaching, but it's not an audience that's amenable to a lot of the techniques that you associate with traditional marketing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's an interesting move to make a prominent hire like that. If I had to guess, I mean, I have no inside knowledge of why somebody or a prominent appointment like this, I have no knowledge of why this might have happened specifically, but I think if you're rolling something out that you want a lot of software engineers to build on top of, it's not only important to, inspire faith in that audience, which you can maintain by just creating a solid experience, but I think you would want people that understand what it takes to build and sustain that user base of developers around an ecosystem, which involves kind of an interesting combination of marketing and building products and offerings in the way that will attract them.
Yeah, so that's actually a good, segue to your first question, which is, what is at bottom developer relations in your view, and how do you see it differing from traditional PR marketing?
Developer relations, I think the most succinct way I could explain it, at the risk of a slight oversimplification, is the fusion of software engineering and marketing, generally content marketing. I think back about 15 years when I was actually a software engineer at the time. I think this field emerged around that time, the late aughts, and it was originally called developer evangelism. I think it's probably better that the title's evolved. That's kind of a strange thing to call it. But from the earliest days of the discipline, what was happening was that content marketing to developers, if you're going to segment that audience, generally you are creating tutorials. You're teaching them how to do things in and around programming languages. And early on in the discipline, there was a realization that it's pretty hard to get traditional content creators to do that. So there is and has always been, a subset of the developer community that likes to, share content on blogs or speak or what have you, create content through various media to teach folks how to do things in software. So marketing departments started to bring them into the fold, and that was the genesis of this discipline. And I'm not an expert in what all goes into public relations, but if I were going to draw them on the map together, I would think of developer relations as being a narrow subset of PR. I think of PR, maybe I'm wrong about this, but as being generally about communications, organizational communications across the board. So marketing, reputation management, et cetera. And developer marketing or developer relations is if you are talking to a certain segment of the population and doing it in a certain kind of way with your marketing, this is developer relations. So it's kind of a narrow slice in my mind of PR.
I mentioned Brett Taylor earlier, and I actually work with him in the developer group at Google. And I bring it up because when I landed there was this impression in the PR department that the developers were kind of volatile, or that they were hard for traditional PR people to work with. So there was a sense that they were just sort of like pushing me off to like, yeah, you go do that. You go sort of into the lion's den there. And I think that, a lot of tech PR people have had the experience of sort of dipping a toe into that world and getting it singed. So I'm curious what you think, again, based on your sort of outsider's view of PR, what traditional PR and marketing might get wrong about approaching developers. What are they doing wrong? And broadly speaking, what's the right way?
The way I would categorize this, I think I wrote about it at length once. My take on this is that it's not that developers, and it's a pretty broad segment of the population, so they might have more like disparate opinions than you might think, but developers are and aren't opposed to marketing. I don't think that there's anything intrinsically about the software developer mind that is opposed to marketing or to PR or anything else. But I think what happens when you get into software development from kind of the jump is you're exposed to a lot of people that are vying for your attention, and they're doing it often in ways that are somewhat manipulative. And the main thing I think that drives this for a lot of engineers, or at least this was true when I was in the field, is more recruiters than anything else. So if you were to go talk to any software engineer, they would probably immediately lose track of the number of times that they've had a recruiter approach them about a job that didn't pay them enough or the wrong fit of job and try to sort of convince them, wheedle and beg and plead and manipulate to go on an interview or take a job that wasn't a good fit. And they're exposed to stuff like this, often with the recruiters trying to relate to them by ineffectively using the same jargon that they do. And so what starts to happen is you're bombarded as an engineer by this inauthentic sort of attempted connection. So I think that the reason it might feel at times like walking into a lion's den is that developers become sort of hyper conditioned to having I don't want to call it a BS detector exactly, but like whiffing out inauthenticity, even if they don't realize what they're doing. So they can be particularly skeptical of things like buzz terminology or anything that they perceive as inauthentic. So on the flip side, where I've actually seen people come in from the outside, so to speak, and be quite effective is when they don't make any attempts to do something like, say, create content for a developer audience by pretending to be a developer. If instead they flip around and say, hey, I'm a marketer at so-and-so, and I don't know a lot about software engineering, but, here's what I do know. I've actually seen developer audiences be pretty receptive to that. So for me, I think the key is whatever angle you're coming from, try to make it one that's valuable and don't try to make it anything that it isn't, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, you pointed out that you were an engineer yourself, so you come from a common background. How important do you think that is for someone in developer relations or looking to be in developer relations? Like, how technical does a DevRel expert need to be?
From what I've seen, working with a lot of DevRels in general, at different clients of ours, and my knowledge of the industry, I would guesstimate that probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of people in DevRel have at some time been engineers, maybe of different experience levels. So you don't need an engineering background. One common path I see is that if you're not an engineer by trade or never have been, maybe you go work in a few startups in, say, product marketing, and you get steeped in the culture of developer tools. You have a few tours of creating content, and you get to know the space without actually being an engineer. That's one path in. That said, I think it's probably easier if you have at least a little engineering background, even if it's just having done a boot camp and maybe a year at an organization. You don't need to be steeped in the field, have multiple degrees and 20 years of experience, but I think it'll probably be easier if you want to get into DevRel if you've had at least a little programming experience.
What other skills go into it, beyond just understanding and knowledge of the field? I mean, given the amount of content production that is associated with DevRel, I imagine it helps to be a good writer. A good writer, or I would say good in a particular media. So I think engineering skills, at least, beyond a sort of basic level, aren't as important as people might think. I think you need to be pretty good at communication in some media, one or more. So some DevRels might create a lot of blog content, tutorials, be good with written content. There are a lot of DevRels that go around and do a lot of speaking. Public speaking might be one. Certainly podcast hosting and guesting, maybe creating videos on YouTube, but something. There's going to be an element of content creation. And I think another important skill that is typical of DevRels is I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, like educational or pedagogical skills, like the ability to teach people things and not dive into the weeds and get away from your audience. So, some affinity for teaching people how to do things, I would say, is important. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like curiosity also plays in, just insofar as that is usually associated with being a good teacher. Like it's difficult to teach people unless you're curious about people and how they learn. And with that said, I have noticed that I described, DevRel as like the triple black diamond challenge. That might be a little unfair. Maybe it's just the black diamond challenge, but truly what it seems to me that the triple black diamond challenge is open source software development, because the passions are real, and it seems so easy to hit the tripwire on some issue related to open source licensing. I'm just curious in your just sort of your experience with that corner of developer relations and any sort of observations you have about how to approach it.
I think your assessment is spot on there, that if you're going to market to engineers about some proprietary offering, that's going to be somewhat easier than marketing to the open source community. The reason I think that that's true, well, there's maybe a couple. One is that if you go back to the early days of open source, like these days, kind of every, even Microsoft, has like all kinds of open source stuff in their portfolio. But like 20 years ago, you had the closed source community and the open source community, and it was two different philosophies or ways of life. And the open source community tended to be more, they believed in democratized software, so they would really get behind things like net neutrality, for instance, and open, freely associating internet. And there was some resentment of proprietary technologies. I don't think you have that kind of divide anymore. But with the open source community, they're going to tend to believe more in the openness of standards and the internet, which lends itself well to a little bit more skepticism, I guess, of commercial interests. I would, at the risk of painting too broadly, but I'd say on average, the open source community tends to be more skeptical of commercial interests in marketing. And they're also dependent on an offering in a way that you don't see with a closed source product. So I guess offhand, if you were to take Chromium, which is the open source product that underpins browsers like Chrome and Edge, if you have a developer community that's working with Chromium, and then you have a commercial interest like Google or Microsoft or whoever in the mix trying to make changes happen to that open source product, that can create tension with the open source community in a way that if it's just a pure Microsoft product that is being sold, the community isn't dependent on the way that the internals of that work. So I think those two things make it difficult. I think that if you're going to market to an open source community or around and on top of an open source product, one thing I would recommend the organization do is try to go get developer relations folks from within the ranks of that community if you can do it. Absent that, you would want to make a serious point of outreach to that community, and through either your own engineers that are not in DevRel or the DevRel folks working for you, be good citizens in that open source offering, meaning contribute to it, improve it, help work on bugs, that kind of thing. So become part of that community instead of marketing at it.
So if we want to become part of the community there and reach developers, I can do it in the forums, but what is the best way to reach them? Is it Hacker News? Is it Reddit? You had mentioned, hey, a lot of DevRels do video content that's pedagogical. Where am I finding them and how am I reaching them most effectively?
Well, if you're going to reach them through the DevRel organization in the context that I was talking about with open source, what you're probably doing is collaborating with them almost certainly on GitHub, where you're exchanging developer forms of communication, pull requests and release notes and so on. That's the most obvious and also technical way to engage those open source folks. In terms of where they consume content, historically and to this day, they'll read aggregators, so Hacker News, certain subreddits on Reddit, that kind of thing. That is a great place to get in front of them, although it's kind of dangerous because of the upvote, downvote mechanics. So you can get in front of them and have it really take off and get a lot of brand awareness for what you're doing if they upvote it, or you can kind of get roasted if they don't like your message. So there's a lot of risk and reward in creating content there. In more, I guess, banal ways, if you're creating content and putting it on a blog and optimizing for search, that's a good way to get in front of engineers because then they're essentially Googling, error messages or tutorials and they get onto your site. Video is another good way. That's a very common way for them to learn. Developers read they'll curate their content a lot, but they'll have RSS feeds and other means of curating blog content and sharing that curation. So they will subscribe to certain kind of audience paradigms, blogs, podcasts. Historically, Twitter was a really good place. I think that that's fracturing a bit. Like some of the community might be going to places like Mastodon or what have you. But what I'm actually seeing a big uptick is in Slacks or Circle communities that aren't exactly private, but they're not just out there on the internet. that it's almost like developers are sort of returning to pre-social media situations where, in the aughts, they might have all been on like a Q&A type site where they would discuss things. So I think you're seeing harder to reach places like a community Slack now as well.
Right. So this is where a vendor has their own Slack community that people can join, and maybe they curate it a bit, but it's a conversational within that. Now, it's notable to me that you didn't really talk about a lot of publications, Newsstack, what have you, where people might get their news. Or do I have that wrong? It's part of the RSS feed that they might sort of bring in.
It may be. I think there is some overlap. So if I think of like media publications that are technical in nature, I imagine there's a decent cross-section of developers that read the Newsstack versus if you had a site like, say, CIO.com. I think what starts to happen is you get more leadership folks in engineering on media sites than developers. That's probably, I think the developers like in group fashion curating the news that they're reading. So you go to a Slashdot or a Reddit or Hacker News and it's news, but it's also news that you can see a bunch of your peers downvoting. So you're not having to consume things that seem like fluff to you. The more it's a media site where there's less of that community curation, I think the more that content will skew towards leaders in engineering.
That's a really interesting point that I think in traditional marketing, there's the assumption that if you place an article on a site that has, quote, good distribution, right, good reach, that you've done your job. But it sounds like for a developer audience, unless that article is highlighted on a site where it's sort of subject to peer review in a way by other members of the community, it's voted up, voted down. It has to pass through that gauntlet or it's effectively invisible to the audience you're trying to reach.
In large part, I would say so. I mean, I think that there are places that you could get in front of developers or situations or subsets of the developer population that would just be reading news articles and consuming them. But I think that you have a lot more luck when you're managing to bypass that crowdsourced gatekeeping that happens in the community. And I think that's just because developers as a market segment are so used to so many people trying to get in front of them. And I should also add that it's harder to get in front of them in other ways. So for instance, you might want to reach them with paid advertising, but developers are very good at installing ad blockers and scripts and so on and so forth that like filters all that out of their world. So through group efforts and individual efforts, developers are pretty good at stopping things they don't want to see from reaching them.
Right. But to that point, it's not the marketing per se. I have a commercial interest in reaching you. They're objecting to, they might not want the distraction. It would be, the problem is more the inauthenticity in that, hey, I'm trying to falsely empathize with you, but I don't really, like, you can hear my accent in this and I clearly don't understand what you're saying. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the reason I say that is because I think of developer podcasts that I've listened to or appeared on. And when the podcast host of a popular, say like Python or Ruby podcast or something says, let's pause and, hear from our sponsor, and then it's a developer tool that's marketing to them, I don't find that really bothers the audience too much. I think a lot of developers think, fair enough, I'm consuming your content. I like this content. I get that you have to pay your bills if I want to keep consuming this. I think they're actually more receptive if they find the content reasonable and the proposition of the advertising reasonable.
Yeah.
I think they're more receptive than people might think, or at least more understanding and tolerant.
Yeah, and to your earlier point, like developers, you think of them not a monolithic group. There's lots of different individuals in there with their own viewpoints. So we run paid media for a lot of companies targeting developers, and they can be very effective. And so, obviously there are pockets of demand within that. Let's talk a bit about content. And when you're writing for an audience of engineers, what are the main things that you need to keep in mind?
To some extent, I would say it depends on, I guess, the intent or the purpose of the content. But I'll talk about tutorials because I think that's a big part of marketing to and segmenting that audience. One of the things that we do with our author pool is we'll tee up a persona for them to bear in mind of who's going to be reading this content. and encourage them to map that to somebody that they actually know. So if they're creating a tutorial in, C#, let's say, it isn't so much write this tutorial in C# as imagine that you're explaining this to an intermediate peer of yours, picture an actual person and explain to them how to do this, and keep in mind at the end of it what you want that person to have taken away. So the reason for all this is that with a lot of this content, if they're consuming it for the purposes of figuring out how to solve a problem they have, which is generally the case with tutorials or looking for solutions to errors, you want to get to the point. You want to equip them with enough information to get where they're going, but not overload them a la, some recipe site where you want a recipe for a marinade and they begin by asking, what is a chicken breast or whatever. So you really want to stay away from stuff like that and create a good experience with the idea that this is a person that you can picture, and you're having them follow along with something that will get them to their goal.
Right. And so that does lead to the point about, hey, how much technical detail is too much, because you could be addressing a tutorial about how to solve a specific problem that someone is presumably Googling or researching in some way that you want your answer to come up. Talk to us about how you find that balance, because sometimes it does feel like some of the audience is very small on some of this, and, how do you justify it?
Well, in terms of technical depth or what have you, I really think provide as much as they need and nothing more, and certainly nothing extraneous. So you don't want to go into asides. Maybe a simple example would be a common thing in programming is writing what's called a hello world program. So if somebody were just getting started in a programming language or stack, one of the first things they'll do is write hello world. So it's basically you're getting just enough of your developer environment and situation together that you can write the most basic program imaginable that just prints to the screen hello world. If you are creating a hello world tutorial, you don't want to muddy the waters by saying, you could actually take input and display whatever the user might want, because that's not the goal. So you want to be complete enough to get the user to or the reader to where they're going, but not confuse them with other things. I think that's a good way to triangulate on the technical depth. In terms of how much audience demand there is, one thing I would say is, especially with something like search engine traffic, the audience is larger than probably people would think. Even with the most niche programming language, you're going to have, I would say, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people out there that are interested in that. I forget when I last looked this up, but there's more than 20 million software developers in the world. So in some senses, it would be hard to narrow the audience down too much unless you were layering other things into the ideation process. We only want to go after super advanced topics, for instance. Then you might start to thin the ranks a little bit too much. But we do a lot of assessment when we're working with clients as to for this distribution channel, is there enough audience? And I guess without going too far into those weeds, what I would say is usually there's more of an audience than people might think.
When, as a DevRel person, a content expert, you are engaging with an engineer, subject matter expert to get the material you need to help them create content, what are some techniques you've found for getting the most out of those sessions? I know in my experience, I've sometimes had these fascinating discussions, and then I realize along the way, we come to the end of our time and, I was so into the conversation that I didn't end up getting what I needed to produce the piece. So I'm sure everyone who's had these brainstorms has had that experience. How do you?
For most of the content that we create at scale, our model is aimed at taking people that are side hustling software engineers, like their day job is software engineer, they're writing content on the side. So in that situation, the fulfillment strategy is really about looking at the topic and trying to find somebody that already knows enough about it to create the content. But we do other situations. I would think the most common one is where we're talking to somebody that's a technical leader at a company, maybe to do a case study. That's generally our rule of thumb is you would enlist us for things where you're better served to have an engineer participating in the content creation. So there can be situations where we're interviewing a CTO about, how they conceived of the architecture for an offering or something like that. In those situations, one of the best tactics for ensuring that at the end of the day, I've come up with something that is fit for purpose for creating content is I will at times during the conversation pause and ask them if it's all right if I repeat my understanding back to them of what they just said. Because even though I have a long background in application development, I might not fully understand. They might be throwing in some jargon that's more recent than my days in software development, or it might just be going too fast or something. So I found that by pausing in that fashion and then reconfirming the understanding, two things happen. One, I might be exposing my own general misunderstanding, which they can correct. But two, they might calibrate a little. Oh, I'm too far into the jargon weeds here. That's right. My audience isn't necessarily going to understand all of those things. So I think that that's a big one. I also will, this is more maybe if we're doing some kind of live interview or if I'm, inviting somebody on something that's pre-recorded or what have you. If they're going into jargon, I might stop and say, hey, the people listening in our audience might not know what a SERP is. Can you explain that? It's a search engine results page, and that also can kind of trigger them to, I guess, calibrate the level at which they're giving information. So those are, I think, two of my most tried and true techniques in these situations.
You said something really interesting earlier about developer relations people, needing a variety or skill in, not necessarily in writing, but in communicating in some kind of medium. And I thought, that raised an important point that, in marketing, so much of our attention is typically on the written word, but at the same time, you're seeing so much more developer-oriented content developed for video, among other media. So how do you see those newer forms or less traditional forms of media playing into the programs that you're involved with? Do you see more of it, pretty much the same as always? Is it growing?
I think that the video and podcast as media are growing, and they're increasing in market share, for lack of a better term, of the content portfolio that's put out. But I don't think they're growing as fast as I would expect. And I think that more has to do with companies and how they're producing the content. Like in a lot of ways, written content or digital print type content is easier. So if you're producing video content, you can decide to be all right, I guess, with the quality of content you get simply by streaming or by inviting an engineer to record themselves creating content. But a lot of companies are hesitant to put out that type of content or that quality of video content. So what winds up happening is the content maybe doesn't get created because it would require editors and other things to be layered into the mix. So I think there's progress, but not as much as I would imagine. And that's a shame because a lot of developers learn better by consuming video or content or listening. The style of written content isn't how everybody necessarily learns best.
To that point, does it have to be highly produced? Do developers, from a marketing perspective, you might look at it and this thing needs to be finessed, but could I assume that maybe a developer might not care as much about this is streamed and maybe it's a little bit raw, but I'm just getting after the information and there's a lot of signal here. Should they be worried about that?
My take on this is the brands are more worried about polish than they need to be to reach this audience. So I think there is a gap between what the community would consume and what brands want their brand name attached to, and that's a part of the problem. I do think that expectations have risen. Like if you just look at over the years, the quality of influencers, developer influencers on YouTube, the quality of videos is higher than it was, 5-7 years ago. So you would run a danger of it being under polished, not that the developers were going to get upset about it, but they might just mistake it for an amateur channel that's not really worth paying attention to. So I think you probably need something, but I think brands tend to worry more about the polish of content in these media than is justified by the audience.
Right. I've noticed that too. Sometimes I'll see an article that's just very finely crafted, beautifully written. I could tell it took a lot of time to research and develop. But then, you see in the comments, especially with the developer audience, they'll just zero in on the bit they disagree with and say this whole thing was trash. And it's not that they don't have a point. It's just it is interesting the extent to which it's really just about the material, the content, the truth value of the statement. And you can put a lot of energy into the cosmetics that are not necessarily paying off with the audience you're trying to reach.
That's definitely true. I mean, so when we're doing ideation with clients for content campaigns, a lot of it is, getting into the mind of the person that's going to be consuming this. Like, why are they consuming this? How did they get here? And if you think about something like, let's say that you target a keyword with an organic search article, and the keyword is some kind of error message or some problem the engineer's having. In that mindset, they're in their development environment. They just hit some error. They're really frustrated. They just want information on how to solve it as quickly as possible. You could have that on sort of the goofiest site imaginable with like not great UX. But if they scan through a couple of code samples and they get what they need, they're perfectly happy with it. Now, that's not going to be true if you're trying to get to the top of Hacker News with, some informational news article that you put out. Then they're going to be consuming in a more discerning way. But I do think when you're thinking about the media and the quality of, I guess, the peripherals in that media, it's important to think about what the audience is doing and why they're consuming it.
Yeah, I like that. Do you have any other final advice for startups as they're thinking about their technical content?
Probably the biggest missed opportunity that I see, and to some extent, Hit Subscribe brokers this and sets it up with our programs. But we're also, happy to consult on doing this. And I think like more brands come around to it. But I guess what I'm getting at, I'm kind of bearing the lead, is community generated content. It's hard to hire DevRels. These are expensive people. Producing content at scale is hard, especially for an earlier stage startup. But if you can go out to the open source community and encourage those folks to create and share tutorials, that's really inexpensive to do. And you're actually actively engaging the community, because it's an interesting dynamic where your workforce for content creation is also your prospective buyers. So if you bring those people in and encourage them to create content on a platform, that's a very cost-effective way to generate a lot of content that the community likes. I think like DigitalOcean and LogRocket, for instance, are really good examples of this, where they stood up guest contributor programs and created a lot of content that way.
And how do they incentivize that from the community beyond just the recognition within the community?
I think, so DigitalOcean and LogRocket both pay the contributors.
Oh, they're paid.
That's a good way to do it. And I don't think it's because you have to make it as profitable as writing code in their spare time would be, but I think it's more to set a little bit of a barrier to entry. If you're encouraged to contribute to a program, just for the exposure, that gets into the inauthenticity piece that developers are skeptical of, like, oh, okay, just the exposure. I see what you're doing. But even, just paying them a bit indicates that you put some value into that. So obviously paying is a way to get it done, especially in the early going. But I think you can go onto community sites like dev.to, for instance, is a very beginner-friendly community, and you can start to seed that with content and then invite other people to share their thoughts and participate, and you will start to get some traction. Alongside of that, if, say it's an open source offering and there's a community around it, people will sort of create ad hoc content like Q&A site content or just exchanging tips in the community. You can grab those people and say, hey, you should write that up into a blog post on your blog. We'll tag it and promote it or something. So there's a lot of ways you can try to encourage the community to get involved and create content.
So what I'm hearing is be authentic. Don't be afraid to get too technical because there's a big audience for that. Think in multiple different formats and look for ways that you can engage your community and find people and lift them up within that community to create content for you. And that's a great way of sort of getting the technical content that you need to sort of engage the audience and move your program forward.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a fair summary.
Great. Thank you. Great tips in there. So our next section is called Smart People, Dumb Questions, where I literally pick questions out of a bag on my desk. And these are personal questions. So the first one is, what book are you reading right now?
I am actually doing a reread. So I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, I read a book called Getting Things Done, and it was very informative for personal productivity and organizing my life and sort of relieving the cognitive stress of feeling like you have things to do that you're forgetting. And I recommended it to my wife. And when I went back to get it on Audible, I discovered that there had been a new edition kind of completely rewritten for what I'll call the digital age. The last one was kind of old school. So I am reading that. I'm at the beginning, but I'm reading it with some interest to see what's, been updated for the modern day.
Yeah, talk about there's a community around that GTD thing, getting more things done, I guess, in the digital age. But it's a great book. What's the strangest job that you have ever had?
I think I would say so right after college, I graduated with a computer science degree, but it was the middle of the dot-com bubble bursting, so it was impossible to get work. And I took a job as not a UPS driver, but I would ride along with the UPS driver and run packages up to the houses. And I guess there's nothing inherently strange about that, but it's strange for a computer science graduate. And it was just like kind of a really bizarre thing to do. My knees were sore every day, and it was a slice of life.
This is not how I saw my life go, up and down people's and being attacked by people's dogs. If you could learn one skill, like instantly, what would it be? I
think it would be really cool to know how to draw. I mean, I'm just utterly terrible at drawing. Like, I don't even have the slightest whiff of talent, and I'm always like slightly jealous of people who can do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a game, Pictionary. I am the worst person at that, and it's just very embarrassing. What food do you just sort of hate to eat?
I don't hate it, but one thing that I'm not really a fan of that I think surprises most people is like peanut butter type stuff. I'm just not much of a peanut butter. I think it's the texture.
Yeah, fair enough. It seems to have got lots of different types of texture, and like it's in the store. There's tons of them. So for that very reason. So you are not alone. Mine is lychees. I just, for some reason, just don't like them. Odd. It doesn't impact my life much because you don't encounter them very much. Our next section is called Fired Up 5, which is our quick fire round. So take it away, Chris.
All right. These are the 5 questions that we ask all of our guests, and we ask them rapid fire. What do you wish you would have known before you got into tech marketing?
I wish I had known, or at least thought more ahead about separating what I love doing from the business of what I'm doing. And I say that because I have always been a writer just for fun. And it's been an adventure to build a business around something that was always just for fun and turn that thing into a business.
What is the best career advice you were ever given?
I can't attribute this to a specific person, but maybe it's a slight composite of things that I've heard. But it would be the idea that rather than thinking about things in terms of like companies that I work for as an employee in the past or clients or vendors or anything like that, that really your career is made by the relationships that you build and bring with you on your different stops. So I guess the short form of that advice would be that probably relationships with others are the most important aspect of a career.
What is the tool or gadget you've recently started using that is not ChatGPT?
We have been automating some things around SEO checks, and without getting too far into the weeds, there is a tool that we've been using to do this that's an API called Data for SEO. So we've been building these scripts that use this Data for SEO tool to gather information about client sites and search results and such.
What's the big thing you've learned in the last year?
Diversifying our business was a good idea. So we, for a while early on in the business, were essentially just selling blog posts and had the idea post-pandemic to start opening up other lines of business. And it was kind of an open question whether that was folly or a clever thing to do. And I'd like to think we came down on the right side of it and that it's been a good move to diversify.
What tactic are brands overlooking?
I'm going to talk about SEO since that's been on the brain here. And I think with especially earlier stage startups, there's a lot of effort that goes into creating content and building links and all sorts of other stuff with the idea of building domain authority. So the tactic I think that gets overlooked a lot is buying up domains that somebody is tired of running that have a decent amount of authority and redirecting the content onto a site. So basically, rather than spending blood, sweat, and tears to build your domain authority from scratch, that you could essentially do that by buying relatively inexpensively, a handful of existing domains.
That's a good one. SEO is a very important. If you're going to create all this content, it's great if people can find it. So I'm glad I like that tip as well about the data, the SEO data. Erik Dietrich, CEO of Hit Subscribe. Thanks for joining us on FiredUp. If people want to get in touch with you, where should they go?
Well, you can head to hitsubscribe.com, and you can also email me through that site. It is Erik, E-R-I-K, @hitsubscribe.com. Please feel free to reach out. I used to give social media in this situation, but I'm not super active on social media anymore. So website is probably the easiest.
Wonderful. Listen, really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for your time, and we look forward to catching up again with you soon.
Well, likewise. Thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/firedup freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.